So your question is around very similar to mine from a business perspective, but yours is around what happens once a deal is entered into, a contract is signed, and no one thinks about this in the property space, but unfortunately, the difference between when a contract is signed and when you become owner of the property is maybe 2, 3, 4 months, it's sometimes even longer. And a lot can happen during this period, especially if the property is a business property or an investment property. So maybe you just want to run through a couple of things that you've noticed in practice that happened during this time that are actually might even be totally innocent, where the parties didn't realize the ramifications.
Perfect. So, part of our property transaction in South Africa is obviously there's a distinction between when a deal is signed between the parties and when registration of the property actually happens. And there's a bit of a delay that occurs in that transaction. Sometimes the transaction can take a quick, short amount of time, a month or two. And sometimes these transactions happen over a longer period of time, especially when you're talking about transactions where there are perhaps installment sale agreements, etc. Okay, and so there are many different transactions that happen and various different time periods at the point that these at the point of which the property transfers. And what we wanted to talk about today is just when you are purchasing a property, keeping mindful of what is going to happen with that particular property, not necessarily at the point that you sign the agreement, but during the period before the transfer actually occurs. Okay, and we've had some of our writers writing in basically saying that they've had difficulties where they've purchased a property, they've seen the property, they wanted to buy it, and they've signed the deed of transfer, but during the period of transfer, the seller in respect of the particular property has done certain things which might, change the situation after signing the agreement. And what is absolutely imperative is if you are buying a property, you need to make sure that there is a solid agreement between the parties that during the period where the property is being transferred, there are certain limitations on what someone can do with that particular property. Too many times people assume, well, I'm signing the agreements, I've seen the property, I want it in its condition it is now, but then don't adequately cater for what can the seller do to that particular property to make sure that what you're getting is actually what you want in the circumstances. So the example we've received this week is a person who purchased a particular property, and during that transfer window where the transaction was actually being registered in the circumstances, the seller in respect to this property had an agent who then signed a lease agreement with a particular tenant. And now we know the principle in South African law, hier gaat oor koop, means that the lease agreement that's been entered into by the previous seller passes on to the purchaser of the particular property, and the purchaser now steps into the shoes of the landlord. That means they're expected not only to receive the rights in terms of that particular lease agreement so they can receive the rent, but they are obliged to also uphold the obligations in terms of those lease agreements. In other words, they must give occupation of the premises. And this is where the contention came up on our particular case today. Okay, so we just wanted to do a quick note to say, if you are a purchaser of a particular property, in particular, where you are purchasing a property that is, say, being used for a business purpose, say it has a tenant in the particular property, existing, or the landlord is in a circumstance where they were looking for a particular tenant, you must be mindful of trying to define and distinguish exactly what the seller's rights in the circumstances are with regards to either then the existing tenants in that particular property or potential new tenants. Okay, it's something that is overlooked a lot within our particular property transactions, and it's something that's very, very important. So again, this comes down to due diligence. When you are buying a property and finding out exactly what the status quo on that property is, be mindful of what is happening on that property and what you want when that transaction and the transfer ultimately occurs. Do you want to continue with the particular tenants in that particular premises? Know if it isn't existing lease agreements on the particular premises, when is that renewal coming up? is that renewal happen to fall within a window that could be part of the transfer period? And if that is the case, what is your expectation of the seller in the circumstances? Are you going to allow them to extend the lease agreement for a further period? Do you expect them to give proper notice? Okay, remember, a seller, if they are going to give notice to terminate the agreement, if a fixed term agreement has certain obligations in terms of the Consumer Protection Act to give notice that they are bringing the contract to an end. And if you don't want that tenant in the circumstances, you need to place the obligation on the seller to say, I need you to give proper notice so that this tenant no longer continues to occupy after the transfer date occurs. Once the transfer occurs, you will be relying on the notice that they gave the tenants in the circumstances. So there's a bunch of different scenarios that you need to look at. The long and short of the conversation is, make sure you do your due diligence, make sure you know what is happening and where all the transactions are, and make sure that in your transfer documents you acknowledge the situation and make sure you clarify what the parties' obligations are, so that at the end of the day, when the transfer finally comes through, you're not caught out with something surprising.
Absolutely. Yeah, makes sense. Thanks so much, Nick.
Perfect. Thanks, Bruno.
Awesome.
And we will see you next week.
Awesome. Have a good one.
Yes, sir. Cheers.
Cheers.